70 years ago today, an armistice agreement was signed, bringing an end to the Korean War. Around 36,000 U.S. military service members were killed during that conflict.
And 247 of them were from Maine. Those service members were honored during a ceremony today at the Maine Korean War Memorial in Mount Hope Cemetery in Bangor. The Burton Good Sergeant chapter of the Korean War Veterans Association hosted the ceremony, and a bell rang to honor each of the 247 fallen service members.
Joseph M. Colombi.
And I really think it's important for everybody to know that, because this war is what they call a forgotten war. And it's a very bad war. It was very cold. The people were freezing to death, you name it. It was very bad.
Russell M. Bennett. But some of these men that went never heard of Korea. That's how innocent they were, really. They're the reason why we're here today.
Members of the Burton Good Sergeant chapter of the Korean War Veterans Association say it's important to honor the memory of the lives lost during the conflict so they are not forgotten by future generations. The Maine Korean War Memorial was dedicated July 29, 1995, just days after the National Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. The memorial reflects the work of a small group of Korean War veterans who constructed the memorial as a way to honor all Maine servicemen and women, especially those killed in Korea.